What if what we desire most is exactly what's destroying us? We live in an age where pleasure has become the new air, invisible, constant, addictive. It's everywhere. Wrapped in short-form videos, embedded in algorithms that know us better than we know ourselves, hidden in pills that promise peace, in overstimulated bodies, in screens that never sleep. Pleasure is omnipresent. And the more we consume it, the more it consumes us. We're surrounded by stimuli designed to keep us satisfied, but never whole. Always on the edge of a brief euphoria, yet perpetually distant from any real depth. It's an elegant addiction, a gentle intoxication, almost imperceptible, and maybe that's why it holds us so tightly. This isn't a prison made of bars or threats. It's a prison dressed up as freedom. The freedom to choose, the freedom to want, the freedom to feel good. But there's something quietly insidious about it all. That so-called freedom becomes compulsion. And compulsion, when constant, strips us of our center. What we call autonomy may just be conditioning, a mechanical repetition of empty pursuits in the name of a well-being that barely lasts more than a few seconds. Bit by bit, we're losing the ability to face what's real, to sit with silence, to endure discomfort. Contrary to what we might believe, excessive pleasure doesn't liberate us. It numbs us. In the 20th century, two writers envisioned dystopias. George Orwell warned of a world crushed by fear, censorship, and a state that watches and punishes. But Aldous Huxley imagined something more subtle, and in that subtlety, more dangerous. In Brave New World, no one needs to be censored because no one cares. Truth isn't forbidden, it's made irrelevant. People are kept compliant through a drug called soma, through casual sex, through endless entertainment. It's a society where pleasure is the engine of social control. Where the absence of pain isn't freedom, it's anesthesia. And maybe, this is exactly where we are now. We don't live under a totalitarian regime. We're not being coerced. We're being seduced. Every single day. By brands. By platforms. By impulses that have learned to speak louder than our own awareness. The tyranny of pleasure doesn't scream, it whispers. It seeps in. It sugarcoats the poison. And by the time we notice, it's no longer us choosing, we're being chosen by the very things we think we desire. With every click, every scroll, every hit of instant gratification, we hand over fragments of our inner freedom. And we do it with a smile, like someone convinced they're still in control. Perhaps the most terrifying part of this new form of slavery is that it's voluntary. We're trapped by what we love, or at least what we think we love. Pleasure has become anesthesia. And anesthetized, we lose the capacity to feel deeply, to sit with emptiness, to wait, to endure absence. Modern life despises silence, because in silence we hear ourselves, so the world fills it with noise. Constant, colorful, addictive noise. Boredom, once a sacred space for creativity and contemplation, has become unbearable. We need something, anything, to distract us, to keep us comfortably numb. And the market is always ready to provide. But if we're always running from something, what exactly are we trying to escape? Maybe we're fleeing from ourselves. From the questions we can't answer. From the wounds we never healed. From the nameless, aching loneliness we carry within. Pleasure in this context becomes a disguise. A mask so well crafted it convinces us we're happy, even when we're simply too busy to notice the emptiness. As Kierkegaard once said, the most dangerous kind of despair is the one that doesn't even know it's despair. We are too numb to realize we're becoming unwell. There's something profoundly tragic in all of this. The idea that the more we surround ourselves with pleasure, the less we're able to feel anything real. As if the soul is being dulled, numbed, silenced. And paradoxically, the more we chase pleasure, the more flavor it loses. The first bite is exquisite. The 10th, forgettable. The 100th, nauseating. What began as desire turns into compulsion. What felt like freedom becomes dependency. What sparked joy dissolves into addiction. And so, we return to the question, what is freedom really? Is it doing whatever we want? Or is it having the strength to resist what we crave? Maybe freedom is the ability to say no, even when everything inside us screams yes. To withstand discomfort. To walk through our inner desert without reaching for shortcuts. But that kind of freedom demands presence. It demands awareness. And instant pleasure, by contrast, asks only for passivity. That's why it spreads so easily. Because it requires nothing from us except surrender. But every act of surrender without consciousness is a risk. And in this case, the risk is the dissolution of the self. Aldous Huxley wasn't writing science fiction. He was writing prophecy. And we're living inside it. Only now, soma fits in our pockets. We take daily doses, in likes, in purchases, in distractions, in disposable pleasures, and we call it freedom. But maybe it's just the sweetest kind of prison. Huxley never believed humanity would be crushed by brute force. He feared something far more insidious, that we would be seduced into apathy. And he was right. Brave New World, published in 1932, wasn't just a novel. It was a warning. A premonition of what might happen if pleasure became the foundation of civilization. In that fictional society there is no censorship, no violence, no visible repression, only comfort. Endless, effortless, superficial comfort. And it's precisely this excessive comfort that strips us of everything that makes us truly human. Doubt, tension, restlessness, the silence essential to self-awareness. In Huxley's world, pain had been eradicated. People are biologically conditioned to accept their place in society. From birth, each individual is programmed to want exactly what they'll get, to love exactly what they'll be required to do. Love is regulated. Sex is institutionalized. And solitude, avoided at all costs. There's no introspection, no depth. Religion is replaced by the worship of technology. Culture is dissolved into endless entertainment. And whenever something threatens this delicate stability, a loss, a question, a moment of deeper thought, there's soma, a perfect drug. No side effects, no resistance, just pleasure. No pain, no soul. This is the heart of Huxley's vision. A humanity tamed by excess. A society where freedom is exchanged for engineered happiness. Where truth becomes too inconvenient to desire. Where the human spirit is numbed, all in the name of stability. And in the end, everyone seems content. And that's precisely what makes it so terrifying. The great tragedy Huxley reveals isn't the suppression of freedom. It's the voluntary surrender of it. In Brave New World, people don't rise up for their rights. They don't cry out for truth. They don't want to change anything. Because on the surface, everything feels fine. Everything seems to work. Everything is comfortable. And comfort is the subtlest of prisons. Because no one dreams of escaping a place where they don't feel pain. And now, almost a century later, it's impossible not to see the parallels. We're surrounded by modern versions of soma. They don't come in pill bottles, but in apps. They aren't prescribed by doctors, but by algorithms that know us better than we know ourselves. They're delivered in daily doses. Of distraction. Of consumption. Of stimulation. We don't feel fear, we feel indifference. We aren't silenced, we've simply stopped listening. The truth isn't hidden, it's drowned in a sea of irrelevance. We live in the age of artificial emotional abundance. And the more pleasure is manufactured, the less depth becomes possible. With every new stimulus, we lose a little more of our capacity to contemplate. With every new distraction, our tolerance for emptiness weakens. With every new pleasure, we forget, bit by bit, what it means to live with purpose, with presence, with true autonomy. We are increasingly sedated, and we call it progress. But there's a cost. Because when pleasure becomes constant, it also becomes hollow. What once brought joy is now just another click. What once moved us now numbs us. We've grown immune to wonder. Beauty becomes repetitive. Love is reduced to an algorithm. Curiosity fades beneath an avalanche of easy answers. And the soul, starving for meaning, falls silent at the banquet of superficiality. Huxley feared we would be taught to love our servitude. And maybe that's the cruelest irony of modern life. We're not imprisoned by a lack of choice, but by too much of it. We're overwhelmed by desires and emptied of direction. We're not lost because we don't know what we want, but because we want everything. Now, and in that endless wanting, that frenzy of fast pleasures, we end up wanting nothing deeply. Perhaps what Huxley saw more clearly than anyone is that pleasure, when detached from effort and meaning, becomes a kind of spiritual distraction. It ceases to be a celebration of life and becomes an escape from it. And when we run from ourselves for too long, we forget how to return. That's why the real question isn't, are we happy? The real question is this happiness even ours? Or was it manufactured, conditioned, inserted into us by systems that understand our cravings better than we understand our own consciousness? If we no longer have the courage to be alone, without stimulation, without answers, without instant pleasure, then maybe we're closer to Huxley's world than we'd like to believe. And maybe we're already living inside his brave new world. But unlike the characters in his novel, we still have a choice, at least for now. Pleasure, for all its abstraction, is deeply chemical. It lives in the most primitive circuits of our brain, a lingering promise of survival, Originally, pleasure was a reward for what helped us stay alive. Eating, mating, resting, feeling safe. But the world that shaped those instincts is not the world we live in today. The brain, however, hasn't changed. And that's exactly why it can be deceived and manipulated. It all begins with one molecule, dopamine. Dopamine isn't pleasure itself. It's the anticipation of pleasure. The craving. The silent pull that drives us toward what we think we want. When we see a delicious meal, even before the first bite, dopamine is already at work. When we unlock our phones and spot a notification, that jolt of urgency, that's dopamine. It makes us seek, repeat, persist. It's the engine of motivation, but also the fuel of addiction. Our reward system evolved to navigate scarcity. It was shaped in a world where pleasurable stimuli were rare, spaced out by effort, frustration, and time. But today we live in the opposite reality: excess, immediacy, and effortless gratification. And it's warping our psyche. The modern brain is being bombarded by artificial dopamine spikes. Short, intense, repeated bursts, without the space it needs to regulate itself. Like an overworked muscle, it starts to break down. The result? Invisible exhaustion, a hollowing of motivation, a kind of chronic boredom that no distraction can satisfy. Dr. Gabor Mate, physician and addiction expert, says addiction isn't about the substance, but the pain it seeks to mask. And in that sense, pleasure isn't the problem. It's the escape it represents. When we chase stimulation compulsively, we're often not seeking pleasure at all. We're seeking relief. Relief from anxiety, from loneliness, from the ache of not feeling enough. But instead of healing the root, we soothe the symptom. And the more we treat the symptom with instant gratification, the further we drift from the source of our suffering, and from the possibility of true healing. The algorithms know this. Tech companies, media platforms, content creators, product designers, they all study with surgical precision how to trigger microdoses of dopamine in their users. Infinite scroll, variable rewards, intermittent notifications. It's all engineered to keep you engaged, craving, coming back. Your brain is the target. Your dopamine is the product. And the more time you spend being stimulated, the less tolerance you have for silence, for monotony, for the absence of reward. In other words, you lose the capacity to simply be. We live in an era of hyperstimulation, and the paradox is brutal. The more we chase stimulation, the less alive we feel. Pleasure stops being pleasure when it becomes constant. It turns into noise. Food loses its flavor. Sex loses its intimacy. Art loses its soul. Conversation loses its listening. The day goes by, and we don't know where we were. There is no memory in excess, only a diffuse fatigue, a persistent restlessness, as if something were missing, even when we have everything. Psychology has a name for this phenomenon: anhedonia, the loss of the ability to feel genuine pleasure. It's the direct result of a saturated dopamine system, as if we've exhausted our own sensitivity, and the consequences are devastating. In our relationships, in our work, in our creativity, in our mental health, we become smiling zombies, connected to everything, yet disconnected from ourselves. What's most unsettling is that this dopamine machine runs with our consent. It doesn't force us, it seduces us. We are co-conspirators in our own depletion. We want to feel more, but we can't stop numbing ourselves. We crave authenticity, but we can't unplug. We long for depth, but we're afraid of boredom. And in that cycle, we drift further and further from what once made us human: the capacity to sit with emptiness, to wait, to desire deeply, to feel intensely. Nietzsche once said that modern man has lost the great art of waiting. And maybe that's what's making us sick. Our inability to tolerate the space between desire and its fulfillment. We want everything, now. And in that constant now, time loses its texture. Life becomes a sequence of disposable moments. Each pleasure erases the last. Nothing lingers, nothing takes root, nothing transforms us. Maybe the greatest challenge of our time is to relearn how to wait, to desire without rushing to satisfy, to sit in silence, not as punishment but as listening, to live outside the logic of stimulus and reward. Because as long as our existence is chained to dopamine, we're only reacting, never truly choosing. And freedom, if it still means anything at all, can only be born in the space between impulse and decision. We live under a fundamental misunderstanding. We confuse pleasure with happiness, and happiness with meaning. We believe that the more positive stimuli we experience, the happier we'll be. that the less pain we feel, the fuller life will become. But that's an illusion. And like every well-told illusion, it seduces, it soothes. It gives us the comforting sense that we're on the right path, when in truth, we're just getting better at running from ourselves. Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, wrote in Man's Search for Meaning that human beings are not ultimately seeking pleasure, nor power, but purpose. And when purpose collapses, we try to fill the void with substitutes: consumption, distraction, addiction. But the more we run from that emptiness, the bigger it becomes. Frankl called it the existential vacuum, a quiet kind of anguish, hard to name, but haunting nearly everything in the modern world. That nagging sense that something's missing, even when we have everything. When pleasure becomes an end in itself, it ceases to be a celebration and becomes an anesthetic. It keeps us from accessing pain, and therefore keeps us from understanding what the pain is trying to say. Pain has a function. Schopenhauer saw this with brutal clarity. To him, life was suffering, and happiness a fleeting moment, always dependent on the temporary absence of pain. And yet, he didn't see this as a sentence of despair, but rather as an invitation to lucidity, because only when we recognize pain as an essential part of life can we become truly free from it. Modern hedonism teaches the opposite, that anything uncomfortable must be avoided, that pain is a failure, that suffering is some kind of design flaw. But this view infantilizes the soul. It turns us into emotional consumers, unable to bear the weight of real life, a life that hurts, that demands, that frustrates, that forces us to choose what's hard. And it's precisely in those moments, the sharpest, the most unforgiving, that something deep within us has a chance to awaken. Frankl said that even in the worst horrors, in the extermination camps, there were those who still found dignity, who still found purpose, who didn't cling to pleasure, but to something greater, the meaning of being alive, even in the heart of the absurd. And maybe that's the most urgent lesson of our time, to relearn how to live with meaning, not just with stimulation, to stop asking, how can I feel better? And start asking, what am I living for? Pleasure soothes us, but meaning transforms. And the pursuit of meaning is anything but comfortable. It demands surrender. It demands confrontation. It demands silence. And the modern world, governed by metrics of productivity, performance, and dopamine, has no patience for any of that. There's no space for pause, when everything demands urgency. So we settle for crumbs of euphoria, for artificial highs that keep us from going deeper, for quick doses of validation that replace genuine connection. But pleasure on its own is a false shelter. It doesn't sustain us. It doesn't explain us. It doesn't ground us. And like every escape, it comes at a cost. That's why so many people, even surrounded by comfort, feel empty. Why so many, despite material freedom, feel lost. Why even those who have it all feel as though they have nothing. It's not that pleasure is the problem. The problem is when pleasure becomes our shield. When we use it to avoid the pain that needs to be felt, the question that needs to be asked, the change that needs to happen. We run so far from suffering that we become addicted to artificial lightness. But without weight there is no depth. And without depth, there is no truth. So ask yourself, is your pursuit of happiness really a pursuit? Or just another escape? Do you want to live more intensely? Or just feel less pain? Do you seek presence? Or distraction? Do you want meaning? Or just relief? These questions aren't easy, but they're necessary. Because at some point in life, pleasure won't be enough. It won't save us from loneliness, or from death, or from the silence of sleepless nights, when nothing seems to make sense. It's in those moments that we discover what truly matters. And almost always, it's not what we were told was important. Nietzsche once said, "He who has a why can bear almost any how." And maybe that's the way back. To let go of the illusion of a life without pain, and embrace life as it truly is. To endure discomfort, like someone walking through a dark forest, in search of something sacred. To reject the easy shortcuts. To unplug, disconnect, and wait. Because meaning doesn't scream, it whispers, and it can only be heard by those who are willing to sit in silence. Deep down, we don't need more pleasure. We need more presence. And maybe that's the real revolution. To relearn how to stay. There's a kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from the body. A weariness with no name, no diagnosis. But it hangs over millions of us, like a heavy fog. A numbness that blends boredom, anxiety, and a strange sense that we're not really alive. In the midst of a relentless flood of stimuli and pleasure-driven promises, something inside us has gone quiet. Our capacity to feel deeply. The paradox is cruel. We've never been more exposed to emotion, and yet never more disconnected from it. We watch tragedies unfold in real time. We see moving stories edited down to 15 seconds. We witness intimate confessions go viral on millions of screens. We cry for a moment, and then we scroll on to the next. We feel everything. We feel too much, but never for long. Emotion has become a product with an expiration date, and the more we feel, the less we're able to hold what we feel. This emotional overexposure creates a kind of dulling, a natural defense mechanism. The brain, flooded by wave after wave of excitement and distress, starts to protect itself. It shuts the doors, and what once was sensitivity becomes exhaustion. It's like a muscle stretched too tightly, too often, until it stops responding. We lose the ability to touch and be touched. We live in a constant swing between hypersensitivity and numbness, and this pendulum is exhausting, like teetering forever on the edge of an emotional collapse that never quite arrives, and because of that, never fully resolves. Carl Jung once said, "What we do not face within ourselves will return to us as fate," and maybe that explains why we've become such an emotionally dysfunctional society. We were never taught how to face pain, only how to silence it. We've traded depth for distraction, introspection for performance, listening for opinions, compassion for image, and in doing so, we've grown increasingly distant from what we feel, or worse, we've become unable to even name what we feel. But here's the problem with numbing pain. You can't do it selectively. When you shut the door on pain, you also shut it on wonder, on empathy, on that quiet awe in the face of simple beauty. The cost of emotional numbness is steep. It's paid in loneliness, in relational coldness, in a persistent sense of not quite belonging, and above all, it's paid in emptiness, an emptiness that grows right where presence was meant to live. Then there's the other extreme, those who feel too much, the hypersensitive, the ones for whom the world always seems too loud, too fast, too overwhelming. They carry the burden of sensing what others ignore. They absorb pain that isn't theirs. They read between the lines of every gesture. They suffer in silence because they don't know how to switch it off. In a world that worships artificial lightness and the constant smile, feeling deeply is seen as weakness. But in truth, it may be a kind of clarity, a kind of radical honesty. These people live with the cost of their depth, and to survive, many learn to go quiet, to hide what they feel, to mold themselves into a society that flattens emotion. But that silence has a price. It shows up as subtle depression, as chronic anxiety, as illnesses no one can quite explain. The body begins to speak what the soul was never allowed to say, and the result is a fractured existence. On the outside, we function. On the inside, we sink. Both the excess and the absence of sensitivity are symptoms of the same wound, the inability to fully feel. Because feeling, truly feeling, requires time. It requires space. It requires listening. None of that fits within the logic of speed and consumption. We live in a world that demands we stay functional, even when we're falling apart, that we remain productive, even when grief paralyzes us, that we appear light and cheerful, even when life weighs heavy on our shoulders. But we are not machines. We are complex organisms, creatures who cry, who love, who fail, who sometimes just want silence. Sometimes we just want to stop pretending. The problem isn't feeling too much or too little. The problem is that there's no longer room to simply feel. When was the last time you cried without judging yourself for it, or laughed without holding back, or let yourself be sad without immediately trying to change it? When was the last time you truly inhabited your emotion without running from it? The truth is, not knowing how to feel makes us sick, and having nowhere to feel makes us lonely. Nietzsche once said, "Maturity is to have regained the seriousness one had as a child at play." Maybe emotional maturity is something similar, a return to the way we felt as children, raw, honest, intense, without the filters of performance, without the fear of judgment, with the courage to be fully in our own skin. We live in an age where the soul has been privatized, where feeling is framed as weakness, and vulnerability is a risk. But perhaps vulnerability is exactly what we need. The bridge back to what's real. Back to others. Back to ourselves. Yes, the cost of feeling deeply is high, but the cost of not feeling is even higher. Maybe the way forward is to allow ourselves to feel, with presence, with no rush to escape, and no fear of staying. We are no longer in chains. There are no masters with whips, no guarded walls. No one stops us from coming and going, from speaking our minds, from choosing among thousands of possible paths. And yet, we are less free than ever. Because the new chains don't bind our wrists, they bind our desires. They're invisible, soft, and frighteningly effective. The slavery of our time is made of pleasure. And the most disturbing part? We've been taught to want it. We live in an age of superficial freedom, the freedom to consume, to share opinions, to customize our data plans and choose the color of our phones. But much of that freedom is just a simulation. Because while we think we're choosing, we're merely reacting to stimuli shaped by forces we can't see. Algorithms, neuromarketing, behavioral psychology. The science of desire manipulation has evolved so far it no longer needs to persuade us. It only needs to entertain us, to please us. And that's how modern control takes hold, not by imposing suffering but by distributing comfort. Not by demanding obedience but by offering distraction. Control today is pleasurable. It's automatic, voluntary. The danger is no longer oppression through fear, but submission through desire. Aldous Huxley saw this with unnerving clarity. The tyranny of pleasure doesn't need armies or censorship. It thrives when we agree to trade depth for stimulation, truth for entertainment, autonomy for convenience. The real question is no longer, what is forbidden? But rather, what is allowed in excess? Because excess too can be a form of control. Too much information confuses us. Too many choices paralyze us. Too much pleasure numbs us. And in the midst of all this noise, we slowly lose our ability to discern. What do I truly want? What do I truly feel? What actually matters? These questions, so essential, get swept beneath the rug of notifications. And meanwhile we keep operating, consuming, clicking, reacting. We've become cogs in a machine that feeds on our attention. Attention is the new gold. And to capture it, the system learns to know us better than we know ourselves. It knows our fears, our insecurities, our unspoken desires. And it serves us exactly what keeps us hooked. That's how servitude became invisible. Because now we ask for it. We reach out, not for chains but for devices. This new form of slavery is more dangerous than any tyranny of the past, because it feels kind. It strokes our ego. It lulls us to sleep. It whispers, stay comfortable. Everything's fine. But that comfort is a trap. Because it slowly kills the creative discomfort, the pain that pushes us toward meaning, the inner friction that sparks change. A comfortable society doesn't dream, doesn't question, doesn't resist. It just consumes. Bauman wrote about liquid modernity, a time where everything melts before it ever solidifies. Relationships, identities, ideologies, emotions. Nothing is made to last. Because what lasts requires commitment. It requires presence. And a present, grounded individual is a threat to the system. They question. They pause. They choose with intention. That's why the system prefers the fluid subject. The volatile, impulsive one. The one who consumes an idea, a body, a belief, and then quickly moves on to the next. In this world, pleasure becomes the perfect mechanism. Because the more pleasure you chase, the less you stay. This new slavery is consensual. And that's what makes it nearly impossible to resist. You don't fight what you love. You don't question what soothes you. You don't abandon what comforts you. That's why true freedom today requires not just strength, but clarity. The clarity to realize we're being fed what we desire, but deprived of what we need. The clarity to understand that what we call choice might just be a conditioned reflex. And the courage to choose differently, even when everything tells you not to. Maybe the most subversive act today is to disconnect. To stop. To wait. To not give in. To relearn how to say no to what everyone else says yes to. To relearn how to be with yourself, without stimulation, without applause, without a reward. Because in that space of silence, something new can emerge. Something not programmed from the outside, but rising from within. The slavery of pleasure is quiet, comforting, and perfectly tailored to our time. It doesn't scream. It whispers. But if you listen closely, you might feel there's something in it that doesn't belong to you. A subtle anxiety. A nameless fatigue. A longing to disappear, even when surrounded by everything. And maybe that's your soul trying to say, this isn't freedom. There comes a point when pleasure exhausts. When stimulus stops exciting. when even excess becomes boring. And in that moment, when the noise finally pauses, something appears. Or rather reappears. An old feeling often mistaken for loneliness, but it's something else. The void. Most of us spend our lives trying to outrun that space. We fill every silence with sound, every absence with notifications, every pause with dopamine. As if the void were an enemy. As if inhabiting your own emptiness were an existential threat. But what is this void really, if we had the courage to look it in the eye? The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre once said that human beings are condemned to be free, that having no predefined purpose is both a gift and a burden. And it is in this abyss, this existential silence, that the void settles in. Not as punishment but as potential. As uncultivated soil waiting to become fertile. The void is not the absence of meaning. It is the space where meaning has yet to be created. And perhaps for that very reason, it's the only place where truth can be born. But for that to happen we need courage. The courage not to numb ourselves. Not to fill the space on impulse. Not to run at the first sign of discomfort. Because the void is uncomfortable. It reveals what we ignore, what we suppress, what we try to avoid. It is a mirror. And there is no mirror more cruel than the one that shows nothing, because it forces us to confront who we are, without distractions, without filters, without shortcuts. Viktor Frankl, survivor of Nazi concentration camps and founder of logotherapy, said that human beings cannot live without meaning. But he also said that meaning cannot be given from the outside, it must be discovered. And that discovery often begins at the exact moment when we no longer know what we're doing with our lives. The moment we feel lost, disconnected, empty. That's when the path back begins. Modern life taught us that the void is a mistake. That we must fill it with work, relationships, consumption, pop spirituality, or anything else that distracts us from ourselves. But what if the void isn't a mistake? What if it's a necessary pause? A point of restart? A fertile silence? True freedom doesn't lie in the endless pursuit of pleasure, but in the ability not to need it all the time. Real freedom begins when we can inhabit our own emptiness without panic. When we can be alone without feeling lost. When we can say, I don't yet know what I want, but I'm here. That kind of presence, silent and deep, is one of the most subversive acts of our time. Because it breaks the cycle. It disrupts the logic of consumption. It challenges the tyranny of pleasure. And it allows something real, not just reactive, to begin. Yes, the void hurts, but it's a different kind of pain than the pain of excess. It's not the pain of too much, but of not enough. Not enough of what truly matters. And that pain is sacred, because it turns us inward. It makes us look behind the masks. It forces us to ask, who am I without the stimuli? Without the distractions? Without the roles I play? There may be no immediate answer, and that's okay. The answer doesn't strike like lightning. It takes shape over time, in silence, in listening, in stillness. And the more we can stay with the not knowing, the closer we get to something real. Because the void, when respected, isn't absence, it's preparation. It's soil. It's the space between the old that has died and the new that hasn't yet been born. Aldous Huxley envisioned a future where freedom wouldn't be taken by force, but surrendered through pleasure. What he may not have said out loud, but what now reveals itself with stunning clarity, is this: reclaiming our freedom won't come from external resistance alone. It will require an inner revolution. Quiet, intimate, unseen. A capacity to remain with oneself. To cross the desert of distraction and find, buried deep at the center, the spring of one's own being. Maybe we're not really addicted to pleasure. Maybe we're just terrified of feeling the emptiness. But maybe, just maybe, it's in that very emptiness that something essential is waiting for us. Maybe you don't need to understand everything right now. Maybe it's enough to know that you're not alone in feeling what you feel. If this reflection spoke to you, subscribe to the channel. There's still so much silence left for us to explore, together.